Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with my good friend Daniel Vecchio, and today he's going to be talking about Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16 and also 18 throughout the centuries. And what I'm fascinated by is that Daniel has actually been, digging into the sources, and contrary to what a lot of people have said, there actually have been fathers who have made the allusion between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16:19 or 18:18. And so, Daniel, I really appreciate the work that you're doing, because I focus more on the biblical side of things. And as far as I could get, I think it was Aquinas, right? And then you pointed out St. Albert, and then we kept on going backwards and backwards. And then eventually, you assembled this presentation. So I'm really excited to have you on.
Well, thank you. And yeah, this argument from typology, I think, is very powerful. And so anything I can do to support you in this endeavor and find evidence from the tradition that, you're not kind of out on your own coming up with this. So you've already addressed a lot of that in a response video you gave, where you went through some of the contemporary biblical commentators and exegetes with respect to this typology, and what you found is a fairly good consensus, right, among Protestant and Catholic commentators, right?
Yeah, of an illusion. And then the full typology, however, I found that among people like Father Benedict Viviano, Bernard Green, and then others who seem to at least note a very strong parallelism between Eliakim and Peter. So everything short of saying it's a typology.
Right. And so we're not going to rehearse all of that literature, but that can also be in the back of our mind. But I did want to just take the opportunity to thank you for having me on again. I think this is my fourth time on the show, which is kind of cool. And I know that, it's been a big couple of years for you. You converted to the Catholic faith, and then you've become a Catholic apologist for Catholic Answers, which is exciting. And I want to congratulate you on your recent admission to the Dominican Order. That's so awesome. We're all so pleased. So that's just great news. And unfortunately, it does mean that your show is going to be coming to an end. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking of these last few episodes as your swan song, right? The terrible joke, but
no, that's good. Yeah. Well, Daniel, I'm really honored to have known you throughout my time here as a Catholic, and also just, on YouTube and all that. And so I appreciate having run into you and all the work you've done to help me.
Well, thank you. And of course, I did want to bring up the most important thing, which is you've been on Pints with Aquinas with Matt Fradd, which is so awesome. And Matt Fradd had Mark Wahlberg on his show.
Yeah.
And Mark Wahlberg was in Patriots Day with Kevin Bacon, which puts you within 3 degrees of Kevin Bacon. And therefore, I'm 4 degrees from Kevin Bacon, which is just awesome to me. So there you go.
Yeah, well, that's the more you know, right?
I don't know if people still play that game, but
yeah. Well, anyways, I've heard it being done with like multiple different figures, so some of my friends have tried to do their degrees from Jesus Christ or something like that. It's just like those funny kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you believe in the apostolic succession of the church and the laying of hands from apostles to bishops is a continuity, then the hands that touch the apostles touch the bishops that touch the priests and bishops that consecrated us. So yeah, that's crazy. That's awesome. Anyways, without further ado, right, we got to get into this. Let me
and as you pull up your presentation, Daniel, are there any preliminary comments that you want to make, or any like kind of clarifications at the outset?
Well, yeah, I'll bring up the slides and we can I have sort of prelim comments and things like that. Sorry, it is kind of bright.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
I had a little fun with it. I found a template online. So let me begin. I'm calling this talk Sona's Sed Contra, and the reason why is if you think of this whole question of typology and allusion and whatever you want to call it, this connection between Isaiah 22:22, Matthew 16:19, we can really look at it as like a medieval disputation where you have objections from various people. We heard from Dr. Ortlund and from Ubi Petrus and so on. And one of the issues that came up is, well, where is this in the tradition? Where are the patristic fathers? And of course, there are different ways to put this question of whether there was silence, patristic silence, or silence from the tradition. So what I want to say is this is the sed contra of that dispute. It's like you have your objections, and then here's the tradition. Here are the things, as Aquinas would put in his Summa, the sed contra, these are the authorities he quotes. But he never stops there, and that's an important point. I don't want to say that everything just rests on these connections that the church fathers have made, end of story. This is just a point of data that goes into your argument, that goes into the way you're putting this typology case together from various texts, the typology to Joshua and other aspects of the court of the new Moses, this idea of new Sanhedrin. And so I don't want to say that this is the argument, but that being said, so this is only part of what I would call an abductive case for typology. And what I mean by that is we really have competing hypotheses of what explains the intertextual connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. And one of those hypotheses is that it supports the Catholic hierarchy. We could have alternative views that it supports a more Eastern Orthodox view, or maybe even a Protestant ecclesiology, or maybe it's just not relevant. But we have to consider all of these different competing hypotheses in light of the evidence. And so these are data points to consider. One criticism that I've kind of heard and I've addressed online was, well, there are lots of different competing hypotheses out there for how we can understand the connection between the two passages. And since there are all these competing hypotheses, we really can't consider this as evidence for any one of them. And I just want to, at the outset, just say, that's not really how we treat evidence, because really evidence can be interpreted as supporting an infinite number of hypotheses in any given case. And this is true in science as well. The question is how much support, and that there we have to look at the explanatory virtues of the evidence, and we might plug it into a Bayesian type analysis as someone like Cameron Bertuzzi is doing. But you can't just say, oh, well, there are 2 or 3 or 4 hypotheses that this evidence supports, therefore it's of no worth. So that's something I wanted to just address at the outset. Another thing that's sort of a common criticism, although not maybe on a sophisticated level, but something I see online is, oh, well, this didn't prove your case, so it's worthless. And what we have to be careful of is, in history, there's no such thing as proof, right? It's inductive or abductive, and you're really just looking at what sort of a probabilistic analysis here. So the ability to present possible counters and possible other alternative hypotheses doesn't prove that we've failed here, right, in making the case. And the other thing I want to say at the outset is, look, I understand some of the things I'm going to be presenting are more tenuous or more speculative than others. I think some are very strong and others are weaker, and that's okay. I like having weak evidence. If you watched, what was it, the mega podcast that Cameron Bertuzzi did with Chad McIntosh, where they went through 150 odd arguments for God's existence, you could count each of those arguments as weak data points, but taken together, weak evidence can become very strong. So, okay, we might have some weak evidence here, but some of it's strong, and together, I think we've got a good case.
Yeah, Daniel, let me just hop in here really quick and maybe also just add in my own preliminary points, right? Because I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to remove a common barrier that people place up in order to just kind of dismiss the argument out of hand. And it's this idea that, okay, if you're basing this typological connection off of this illusion or intertextual illusion between Isaiah and Matthew, right? Well, let's say if there is this illusion or if there is this intertextuality, we would expect, the fathers of some time period, right, to have made some type of connection. And so the idea is that there's this worry that maybe we're kind of anachronistically finding this connection and imposing what we think about it. But I think what your evidence is going to show is that, okay, no, I think the illusion was actually recognized. A connection was seen. And so now it's the job of the Catholic apologist and theologian to show, okay, why is there the illusion? Not if there is the illusion, because now, we've kind of, I think we can show, okay, there is an illusion not only from just the text itself, but also the reception from the fathers. And so there's this question now, once we deal with those two things, what is the explanation? And so what I've done in my own work is I've tried to show from the text and the biblical theology, it has something to do with the ecclesiological hierarchy of the church. Whereas here, what you're focusing on is just the reception of the fathers to the illusion itself. I hope that's a helpful kind of nuance there.
I think that's a great way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I kind of wanted to address, or let's look at the actual passages. There are a few. I didn't actually list all the passages that are kind of relevant in all of the illusions. Obviously, Isaiah 22:22, and here I put it in Latin because a lot of the sources we're going to be looking at, I've found in the Latin. I didn't bother with the Greek, though I'll be showing some Greek as well. Mm-hmm. A lot of it's not translated. I am not a Latin scholar. I have a minor in classics from my undergrad degree, but that was a long time ago. I did do work in Greek for my dissertation on Aristotle. And so I'm familiar with researching in Greek and working with ancient texts, but yeah, honestly, I'm not a Latin scholar, so that is a shortcoming of my analysis. It means I'm not able to offer live translations for you. A lot of this stuff I had to work out with the help of Google Translate and other resources to try to figure out what's going on. But once you start seeing certain passages, you become familiar with what you're looking at. So you want to look at this et dabo clabendomus David super umerum, right? That's and I will lay on, or I will give the key of the house of David upon his shoulder, right? And what it will open, none will shut, and what it will shut, none will open, right? And you can see that cloud it and appareat, right? So sorry for my stumbling over pronunciations too. But if you know some Spanish or Italian, I studied Italian in school too, so a lot of these words are familiar to us from other languages. And of course, you see the similarity in the way Matthew's translated in the Vulgate. Et tibi dabo clavis regnum calorum, right? I will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And then instead of shut and open, Christ says to Peter that he will loose and bind, right? That these are different verbs that are describing that action. We then find in Revelation, which it uses Isaiah throughout, explicit reference to the key of David, the clavum David, right? So there it is again in Revelation 3:7. You see the keys show up also in Revelation 1:18, where he's talking about having the keys to life and death, and to the abyss, which is in Revelation 20. I think an angel has that key. So these are clearly heavenly keys. Also, a lot of the church fathers, when they're reflecting on the keys, will go to Luke 11:52, where it says, "Woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You yourselves have not entered in, and those who are entering in you have hindered." So you see this sort of play on the entering and hindering, not entering, right? That same imagery is being used. And this is significant because you will see a connection not only to Matthew 16 and Revelation 3:7, but a lot of references to the church fathers will make to Luke 11:52 as well, and connecting the various powers of the keys. For them, it's pretty much, if it's not one key, it's like a bunch of keys on the same ring, right? Like Christ has, a lot of keys, and they're all on the same key ring.
Yeah, Daniel. And before you continue too, I don't know if you're going to get into your first quote just yet, but I remember you were talking to me, and you mentioned it just now too, that the reason why I think a lot of people can't find the illusion in the church fathers is because a lot of the works that you've been looking at were either in Latin or Greek and not translated into English. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so, as English speaking people, we shouldn't have this bias to think that, especially in the 21st century, I can't find it on a simple Google search or even a commentary, and therefore
doesn't exist.
Yeah. Right. And that really is going to address my next slide, which is this question of silence, and particularly the Septuagint, the LXX as it's called, which I wanted to make a comment about. I think in your debate, and you can clarify the point better than I could, but I was rewatching it. Ubi Petrus is sort of this team of Eastern Orthodox apologists. And one thing they were addressing was, well, if you go back to the Septuagint, the keys aren't there. The keys are missing, right? Where are they? And indeed, you can see that here's a standard sort of Septuagint passage is rendered, and I will give him the glory of David, and he shall rule, and there should be none that speak against him. It's almost like a gloss of what you have from the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, which is it's sort of like a more broad way of putting it. I don't know how to say it, but it's funny.
It's more like an interpretation, than an actual translation.
Right. And I think, did Ubi Petrus say something about, well, the LXX is authoritative for the Orthodox Church, and so this typology might be weakened?
Well, he just mentioned, he mentioned that the Septuagint, and I might be weakening his words because I don't remember it fully, but I do remember him saying something about like the Septuagint being a very important inspired text.
Right. So it's not like they're the King James onlyists of Orthodoxy, right? Where it's like the Septuagint is the official word of God, but it has a place of authority, just like the Vulgate has a place of authority for Catholics. And so I get that this concern, well, where is it? And indeed, there are LXX variants that conform to the Masoretic texts, Aquila and Theodotion. And I even, let me see if I can bring this up because I have the link here, just really quickly. This is, I think, in the Minor editions. You can actually see some of this. I know it's in Greek and Latin, but you can see here's Aquila, the Greek.
Hey Daniel, so we can't see your screen. I can only just see the PowerPoint right now. Yeah.
Okay, let me change that so you can see what I'm seeing. I apologize. Okay, let me do this one. Better?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so there's the in Greek it says Aquila, and you can see the Latin there. You can see indeed, I don't know, let me see if I can I can't really increase this.
No, that's okay.
It's very small, but you can see Claida, Oiku, David. You see that? That's the key of David, right? And so he's talking about it there. It's in a Greek translation. Let's see if we can find it. The other one was down here, Theodotion. There it is, Kaidoso. That's I will give the Claudia, Oiko David. So there you go, the house of David, the key of the house of David. So they're just trying to show some of these are more fragmentary than others, but it's definitely not the case that the LXX is uniform. It's like any other ancient text that's been copied over many, many times.
Mhm.
You have glosses that get in, like the Johannine, what is that, the passage of the Trinity in
Oh,
the
one of
letters of
John's
John.
epistles.
Yeah,
Yeah. So the manuscript
comma.
tradition,
Yeah,
basically. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
things get in there. Things are left out. Things are fragmentary. Some of the Codex Vaticanus, I think, has this big gap at the end of Isaiah in this section, as if it just didn't get copied. So, I
Mhm.
mean, we just don't know what's going on with a lot of these ancient texts. They're fragmentary. And so that should make us very cautious when we're using arguments from silence. By the way, do you see my slides, man?
Yeah, I see him again.
Oh,
Mhm.
okay. Yeah, just want to make sure.
And not to jump ahead too far, but actually, I'll just add in here too. When I've looked into different translations and versions of the Septuagint, some of them will only say, "I'll give him the glory, of the house of David or of David." Others will say the keys, right, and not say anything about glory. And then some translations of the Septuagint
Come on.
will say glory and key, and it's like, wait,
Yeah.
what's going on here? Like, this is
Yeah, I think they're
really
just combining
strange.
yeah, I think a gloss made it in, and I think then they were combined. But I mean, this is my speculation. I'm not
Yeah.
an expert,
Mhm.
but that seems plausible to me anyways. And so, this might actually um, work in the favor of explaining why there's early silence, because if you're a church father using a particular version of
Yeah.
the Septuagint, you're just not going to be aware of that key connection. So, I mean, I will give you glory is not really going to parallel I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven.
Mhm.
And so they're not thinking about it. Now, granted, I looked through Jerome and I was expecting to find something there, and he just doesn't bring it up. So the other thing is, you can have this expectation, oh, I want Augustine to say it, I want Jerome to say it, I want,
Mhm.
all those Latin fathers to say it. And it's just the way the cookie crumbles. Some people, they just have different interests, different ways of thinking, and you can't say, well, unless this person says it,
Right.
the case isn't there. When I was I've sort of had a different trajectory in my apologetic work. Initially I was very much interested in engaging with atheists and arguments for the existence of God. I still am, but less so, I think, now. And for a while, I was really interested in engaging with Unitarians. And I remember engaging with one biblical Unitarian who was sort of insisting that I had to find the Trinity in like Acts 2 in St. Paul's speech after Pentecost, right? So, and
Mhm.
if it's not there, if it wasn't in the very first proclamation of the gospel, then it's not important and it's not really Christian doctrine.
Mhm.
And you can do this sort of like narrowing. Well, it has to be mentioned here, or else I'm not going to really pay attention. And I think that that's a misguided way of looking at the evidence too. And then another thing so with respect to that, you can think about when things tend to come up. And when do things tend to come up, Suan, when you're looking at sort of biblical evidence for things like a lot of the proof texts for Christ's divinity? When does that kind of start being brought out? Isn't it really when there's a controversy, right?
Mhm.
So you're looking at, the Council of Nicaea, where, and Athanasius bringing out all these texts that might not have been thought of before, or just haven't been commented on explicitly. He's talking about the Yahwehs in Genesis and things like that, and really bringing out all these texts to make a case because there's a controversy. So, when would this kind of come up? This issue of the Pope's authority, and when might we expect it? Was there a church council that kind of addressed papal authority in recent history?
Well, I mean, just
Well,
the First Vatican Council, right?
First Vatican Council.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I've even seen some murmuring among Catholics who are commenting on your argument. Well, why don't we see the First Vatican Council, right? So, you know what? Let's go to the First Vatican Council, okay? And indeed, what I did find, it's not in some of the more dogmatic proclamations, but in the Acts and Decrees, which kind of give you the backstory of what's going on, right? They're talking about this, and they're talking about the metaphor of Christ talking to Peter. This passage is about giving Peter the keys and binding and loosing. You see the keys that close and open, right? And again, I'm kind of the closing and the opening. And you see here that it says the words of Christ here sound the same as those of Isaiah, right? The words of Christ that I will give you the keys of David, the way they put it. They left out house of David. And they're actually here, this is very much close, echoing Revelation. And so what they're saying in this passage is that it explains Christ's metaphor of loosing in Matthew 16:19 by referencing the way keys worked in the gates of ancient Israel. Okay, so that's what they're talking about it, the way the Hebrews used gates. And it notes, moreover, that the words of Christ uses sound the same as the prophet Isaiah, right? And so they're saying that there's a connection there. Now, I'm not an expert on church documents, so I floated this over to our friend Michael Lofton, just saying, like, well, what kind of status would this have, the Acts and Decrees? And he says that it would not really constitute a magisterial teaching, but it might have something of interpretive authority for Catholics to look at this. And I say this not to invoke circular reasoning, like, oh, well, it's authoritative for Catholics, therefore it should be authoritative for Catholics, or something like that, or we should all accept it because you should become Catholic and then think it's authoritative, because that would be silly. But
but what you're noting, I guess what you're noting, Daniel, is that when Vatican I was, kind of defining, in very nice explicit terms, the power of the papacy, it was aware, the Council Fathers were aware of the allusion between Isaiah 22:22 and Matthew 16:19. And so it's not as if this was an unheard of allusion for the First Vatican Council. Actually, at least the fathers there seem to have been aware, right, of what was going on with this scriptural passage.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and so it's part of the Catholic tradition. It's not, something that has been recently found in scholarship and now I'm using it. It's like, no, even our own Council Fathers were aware of this allusion.
That's right. And so this is an expected reference. If you're saying, okay, well, councils addressing papal authority should be using it. Well, they did. And not only that, I think this is significant because if we're thinking from an internal critique of Catholicism, we need to think in terms of what we would expect if Catholicism is true, right? And we need to think in terms of, so this isn't so much an argument that maybe argues a non-Catholic into the Catholic Church, but this is sort of, if you're standing outside of the Catholic Church, you might say, well, what should we expect? Wouldn't this be referenced, and wouldn't this be a sort of significant passage? And it is. Of course, this is the 19th century, and the way I did this little presentation, just to kind of build the tension and excitement so that maybe people stay towards the end, is we're going back in time. All right. So we got to jump in our DeLorean and kind of keep going back. Okay. Sorry. But yeah, the First Vatican Council, that's obviously fairly recent. So maybe that doesn't impress people because people like to be impressed with older things. So we'll keep going. And we're going to go visit St. Ignatius of Loyola. Of course, near and dear to my heart, since I was educated at Boston College and Marquette University, and my great uncle was a Jesuit who was a missionary to Jamaica. So I have a heart for the Jesuits, no matter what people might say against them today, that they're too modern or something like that. I love the Jesuits. I think they're amazing and well-educated, and this is our founder. Now, he's significant, of course, as a church father for the Catholics, But he's also right at the beginning of the Reformation. And so I chose him to highlight because there are so many Jesuit writers during the Reformation. They're part of the Counter-Reformation, and they're going to be using this text all over the place. I highlight one other on the next slide, but really, if we were to include every Jesuit respondent they're addressing papal supremacy, um, universal jurisdiction, that sort of thing, they're going to be using this passage like crazy, and it would really just expand our presentation beyond what is needed. And plus, they're all kind of lumped into the same Reformation period. So let's pick him, right? Let's pick him. And I found an English translation of a letter he wrote in 1555. So just, I don't know when we officially start the Reformation, within 30 years of Luther, right, kicking it off, thereabouts. And let me read a little bit of this, if you don't mind. Okay. So it says, and a still greater reason was the wish that your highness have spiritual fathers who possess the true power and authority of the Holy Apostolic See and the true teachings of the Christian faith, both of which are symbolized by the keys of the kingdom of heaven, which Christ our Lord promised and afterwards gave to St. Peter and his successors. He first promised the keys when he said to him, and then it's quoted in Latin, which we don't have to go through, but it's the quote from Matthew 16:19. And in fulfillment of the promise, he gave the keys to St. Peter after he had risen from the dead and before he ascended into heaven, saying to him 3 times, Simon Jonah, what is this? This is the feed my sheep. Do you love me? That sort of thing, right? By putting Peter in charge, not of part, but of all the sheep, right? And you talk about this with respect to the sheep, right, in your typology. So
yeah.
Yeah, so there's another reference to it. He gave him the fullness of power and required to keep the faithful in the pasture of Christian life and religion, and to guide them to the pasture of eternal joy in the kingdom of heaven. The passage continues, to the other apostles, Christ our Lord gave delegated authority. To Peter and his successors, he gave ordinary and full authority so that it could be communicated to the other pastors according to their needs. They must obtain it from supreme pastor and recognize him as their superior. As a figure of this power, God our Lord says in Isaiah, speaking of Eliakim, the high priest, and then it quotes Isaiah 22:22. Here we find St. Peter and his successors prefigured, for they possess the complete power represented by the keys. So this is almost explicitly your argument, right?
Yeah.
I mean, right.
And using the word prefigured, it's typology. So
this
it's
is
not
typology.
Just the illusion, it's the typology. Yeah.
Right. And he's writing at a time when it would be relevant for this to really come up, because this is the time when papal authority is being challenged. And I did find, I wanted to highlight one other reference, and this is self-serving, because, I have this fixation on Caiaphas and Cephas, right?
Yeah.
That we find in Jacobus Tyranus, a Belgian Jesuit biblical scholar, and I give you the source here. Here again, he's comparing the taking down of Sobna in Latin, and Caiaphas, and the raising up of Eliakim and Petros, right? So there, I think this is another indication of typology, right? Where we're actually seeing 2 types, antitypes. And of course, you can all go back through the archives to find my discussion of why I think Caiaphas and Cephas are really the same name. So that Christ was actually using a polemic in naming Peter, not just the rock, but the rock after another person who called himself the rock, which is Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas, right? And so here, again, a very clear allusion. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that. But
I don't know what the next quote is because I didn't remember all 18 of them
Right.
beforehand.
No, and I've sprung some surprises on you. So,
Yeah. But I don't know. Do you have Cardinal Cajetan on this list or?
I saw the referent and I didn't include it because I just thought, well, we're just going to include all
Right.
that covered kind
Yeah.
of.
So, I mean, Scott Hahn was the one who told me to like look there. And so, yeah, I mean, he does also make the illusion. But yeah, during the Reformation, left and right, Catholic scholars and priests were using that illusion to combat the Reformation. And so, yeah, this is very much part of the Catholic tradition, should any Catholic be skeptical. But anyway,
Right.
keep on going, Daniel.
Okay,
I'm
we got to
enjoying
jump
it.
back into our DeLorean, right? Have Doc set the date. We're going back to the late 15th century. Okay. And this Pelbartus, I'm not even going to try the rest of his name, but Pelbartus, which, that's a great name. If anyone's thinking, what should I name my son? I think that name's fallen out of disuse. We could have some Pelbartuses, right? He's a Franciscan, writing just on the edge of the 15th into the 16th century. This sermon actually is like written right at the end of the 15th century. I had to pop this into Google Translate, really. So I apologize if it's a little clunky. But you can see it says, "Blessed Peter with the keys, namely the teaching of the faith of Christ, and likewise Paul opened heaven through the world to innumerable men. Another spiritual key is true repentance, which opens heaven. Do penance, the kingdom of heaven will draw nigh. O penance, you who are brighter than the sun, more precious than gold, you'll loose all your bonds, you open paradise. This opened paradise to the thief and to Magdalene and Peter after denial, and to Paul by conversion. The third key is Christ's blood and punishment." And then it quotes Isaiah 22:22. Okay, this I think goes back to Jerome and Ambrose, who want to connect Revelation and the fact that Jesus has the key of David to that being Christ's blood. Okay. And so this whole sermon is on Matthew 16:19. It's about the keys. And he's really drawing on his own work on the commentary of the sentences of Peter Lombard, who talks about the keys in, I think it's book 4, distinction 18 and articles 18-19, where he gets into the keys. Lombard does not make reference to Isaiah 22:22 there, but he does talk a lot about the keys and what powers they have. And so most of the commentators, including Pelbartus, are going to draw on Isaiah 22:22. So we'll see the commentaries come up a few times, but it's very clear that this sermon that he's using is drawing on insights from various commentaries on the sentences.
So in other words, this is not so unlike what we just saw previously, this isn't the full Peter Eliakim typology, but it's showing that with this kind of quotation, right? Like when they were examining Matthew 16:19 and trying to understand the keys, Isaiah 22:22 was also invoked. And so it was kind of all lumped in together, the keys of Matthew 16:19 and Isaiah 22, along with other passages.
Through particularly Revelation 3:7. So they're understanding the keys Christ gave to Peter. Notice in Revelation 3:7, by the way, it doesn't say that Christ was given the keys as in Isaiah. So a lot of people say, oh, that's a more direct allusion. But it doesn't say Dabo. It doesn't say I will give. It says I have the keys.
Right. Yeah.
It's Christ's keys to give because it's Christ's passion and death that opens everything up. So the question then is and this comes up a lot, who has the keys? Who's giving the keys? And who receives the keys? So the connection here is it's really the same, as I said, it's the same key ring. I don't want to say it's necessarily the same key because we already see it in Matthew that there are multiple keys, and the interpretation on what the multiple keys are throughout history. Some have said it's the key of judgment and the key of mercy, binding and loosing. Others have even suggested that there's sort of a secular and religious power there, but that led to a whole controversy through the Middle Ages, which we'll get to there. But yeah, so this is exciting to me. And again, I was thinking about this one. I don't know how you would take it, but oftentimes Eliakim's name just doesn't come up.
Yeah.
And even Peter's name doesn't necessarily come up. But I think it's implicit in the pronoun, in the you. I give you this key.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the you referring to? I mean, the biblical commentators wouldn't have been ignorant that this is given to Eliakim, that this is given to Peter. So do we have to have their names referenced in the sermon to know what's going on? I don't think so. I think it would have been known well enough to those receiving this sermon to understand what the reference
Right.
is.
Assuming just like kind of basic scriptural competence on the part of these, scholars who are using the passage, even if they don't explicitly insert the name of the recipient. Mm-hmm.
Right. They would know. They would know. All right. Back in time further to the 14th century. This time I found a reference to a Benedictine monk. So you see, we've got Jesuits, we've got Franciscans, now we've got a Benedictine monk. Got to cover all the bases, right? This is Ranulf Higden, another name that maybe we can have some babies named Ranulf. That sounds like a great name. And he developed a glossary for sermons, and it was used, in other words, to kind of inform the sermon we just saw, right? And here, one of the glossary passages is on key. So you look through, well, what are the meanings of the word key? And here's a translation from that. Thus, in that time when there was as if a war and dissension between God and man because of sin, the key of paradise was handed over to the armed cherubim. I went back to there. They don't actually reference a key. It's a flaming sword, right? But that's being interpreted in, I think. But afterward, Christ says to Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. This was first proven Isaiah 22:22, right? So there again, Christ is giving to Peter, and the idea of this being proven, I'm not sure exactly what he means, but I think it's sort of that he has the authority to give the keys, was first said or prophetically said by Isaiah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and once again, that language of, I don't know if we first proven, right? So we have an earlier type, and then you now have, it later fulfilled, but afterwards, right, in Peter. So, people might be cautious about saying that he's making a typological allusion here. But I mean, typically with typology, you'll have the earlier type and later antitype. And then here you have, this was first proven for Isaiah 22, and then but afterwards, Matthew 16:19. So there is a historical correspondence being claimed here. And that's one of the fundamental arcs or portions of what constitutes a typology, a historical correspondence between something earlier and something later.
That's right. It's also interesting. He talks about this being evident that he has the key. It's on the shoulder. It's not hidden as a cellarer hides a key, which is sort of an interesting point. So the possessor of the key, it should be pretty evident who's holding the keys. And there we have the Vatican flag right there. Right? So I'm sorry, I'm not laughing in a sort of triumphalistic way. I'm laughing at my corny humor. So, okay. But yeah, I think there's something to be said there that, some ecclesiologies are very invisible, right? And we don't really know what the church looks like, and we don't really know its boundaries, and we don't really know who has the authority here. But I think Ranulf makes a good point. Christ is giving this in a very visible way. It's not a physical key, but it is a literal key, I think. It is a concrete authority that he's giving. He's calling it a key. I mean, we use the word key for passwords, and we use key in a lot of different senses. I have a digital key to get into my computer, right? Well, Peter has a literal key to the kingdom, right? What happened? Did he turn it in on his way up to heaven and say, here you go, Christ, now you have it, and now the church doesn't need it anymore? Or Did it get dispersed? And that's an interesting thing. Now who holds the keys? In a sense, the key is ministerial, right? So we'll talk about that too. And this is a point that the Orthodox will make, in that all bishops have the key, and that's right. And you'll see this in the commentaries. But they'll say it's through Peter's key, which is ultimately through Christ, right? It's Christ. Christ is the key. Christ is the key. So anyone who ministers is operating that key, which I would say, this might be controversial. Maybe I'm going too far, Swan. You can stop me. But who can baptize? Because one of the things that I see in the commentaries is that baptism is an application of the keys. Who can baptize?
Anybody, technically.
Yeah. Even a non-Christian can baptize if they have the right intentions and recite the correct formula, according to the Catholic Church, at least. I don't know what other Christian traditions will say. But in that sense, they're acting as anonymous Christians. They're acting with the authority of Christ, because they're saying, I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. They are acting in the words of Christ. Now, do you want to say that, a non-Christian can, in effect, turn that key for someone? That's kind of cool.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me too, like, my response to this kind of objection from, the Orthodox and others about how, the fathers will talk about how, Peter is a type for all bishops, right? Or like something about his keys being applied to the apostles or everybody else. And one of my responses is, well, yeah, I agree that Peter is a type for all bishops and priests and ministers in whatever capacity in the hierarchy of the church. But that doesn't mean that all bishops are Peter, right? There's a distinction there that even I think the fathers would say, there is one distinct bishop who can claim to be Peter, to be his successor in that unique lineage.
Right. And you see how significant succession becomes early on in the church apologetic when addressing heresy. Right. So this connection that each of the apostolic churches can sort of get out their roles and say, no, look at who I was ordained by, and I can trace it back to the see of Peter or of Mark or Thomas, right, in India or something like that. Okay, we're getting a little far afield, so let's continue our journey through time. And this one, I kind of want to surprise you. Not a church father.
Yeah.
Dante Alighieri, right? 14th century here. The Divine Comedy, sometimes called the Summa in verse. I would say, this is my comment, that it's one of the most polysemous works outside of the Bible and Plato's corpus. That is, polysemous meaning many meanings. It's layered. I mean, it's the same thing. You look at the Bible, and I think Augustine says it's shallow enough for a child to swim in, but its depths can be explored by the greatest minds and never be plumbed, right? The same thing with Plato, I think, obviously these non-revealed works are not as meaning laden, but I can return to Plato I could read the Republic every year and find something new, right? So there's some works that are just obviously just soaked in meaning, and the Divine Comedy is right up there as one of the great works. And so I've referenced Dante as a secular source, although he is part of the Christian tradition, because it really is, I think, fascinating. Okay, so Canto 13 of the Inferno, we're in hell. Okay, so our journey has taken us to hell. And what you find here, this is a commentary from Robert Hollander. We encounter Pierre de la Vigne, or de la Vigne, Peter of the Virgin, who was a steward of Emperor Frederick II. And if you know anything about, this is a Holy Roman Emperor who really ruled from Sicily and was this sort of very powerful ruler, had all these conflicts with the Pope. In fact, Pope, I think it was Innocent the Fourth, declared him a precursor to the Antichrist. Okay, sort of this So he had his own kingdom, and he has the steward, right? And so Dante references him. I'll read the English. When we encounter him, he says, "I am the one who guarded both the keys of Frederick Hart's and turned them, locking and unlocking them with such dexterity." All right, so this is a reference to a steward with keys. Now, this takes on a special significance, right? Because Dante is in hell, and he's encountering a Peter. This is a false Peter, all right? And Dante is continually considering or contemplating false Peters, false popes, and putting them in hell. And this is one of them. He's not a pope, but he's a steward of the emperor. And it says, he was made judge and notary, and for more than 20 years, he was trusted minister and confidant of the emperor. He was at the height of his power in 1247, but 2 years later was accused of treachery and was thrown into prison and blinded, and soon after he committed suicide. So he's in the circle of the suicides. Holding the key to the emperor's heart, the promised land, and of seeking courtier, this Peter is a parodic version of St. Peter, who in Christian tradition holds the keys, one mercy, one for judgment, that unlocked or locked the kingdom of heaven. And then the commentator says, for the original biblical image of the two keys, see Isaiah 22:22. Now, what's really interesting is that going back even further to the 13th century, they were writing letters in the court of Emperor Frederick II that explicitly compares Peter to Saint Peter. And Nicola della Rocca even references this passage about opening and shutting, having the keys of the empire and opening and shutting. He's explicitly referencing Isaiah 22:22. And so the point is that this Peter, is a steward of the emperor, and this is becoming such a common image that it's being applied in a civil context within Christendom to understand this Peter as a steward of the emperor who has the keys and is sort of operating them as his own sort of antitype to Peter. And if you think about it, right, so from Dante's perspective, Frederick II is sort of this false promise, someone who will stand up to papal authority. He's an antichrist. Peter is an anti-Peter, and he's using this image. It really, I don't think it's Isaiah 22:22, but really Shebna that should be invoked here, but because he's taken down. But it is that sort of thing. I think you were talking about this the other day, of how typology can really echo into history. And even, you see a friend who looks like another friend, right? You're saying something about that. And here, so this typology is such common currency that Dante would put it in his poetry, and courtesans and court ministers of Frederick II would be using this imagery to sort of understand this person's role. By the way, I get to visit Emperor Frederick II's tomb in Palermo about 20 years ago, and it is entirely made of imperial porphyry, which is this red marble that was mined to extinction it's from Egypt. And ounce for ounce, because it's basically gone from this earth, it's worth more than platinum. So it's sort of just impressive.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah, I just want to know two things about what you just said in the slide. I think the first is that, when you look at Nicola della Rocca's quote here, when he says, and what he opens, et nemo apparet, no one will shut. What he shuts, no one will open, right? That's going back to Isaiah 22. And then, as you pointed out, this was now being used even in non-theological, secular, popular circles, right?
That's right.
And so the idea then is that people, and this is used in reference to the bad Peter, not the good Saint Peter, right? And so even in pop culture, people were aware of the illusion, it seems, at least, during this particular, what is it, 13th century comparison. Mm-hmm.
That's right. And it makes its way into a 14th century poem that comes, 50 years or so after the events,
Mm-hmm.
to try to understand it. That, I mean, a poet wouldn't put an allusion in there if it's going to be completely lost on the audience.
Right. So
right?
It's assuming a popular understanding was already present. Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Wow.
Okay. So I kind of sprung that on you. I know you say, well, this isn't a church father, but it's part of the church. It's part of the Christian tradition, right? Mm-hmm. That, it's like finding something in Shakespeare, right? That, in many ways, you can't understand Shakespeare if you've never read the Bible, if you're illiterate of the Bible, right? You need those references. Dante is like that. You need a commentary when you read Dante. And when you open up the commentaries, they're all going to point to this. They're going to point to Matthew 16:19. They're going to point to Isaiah 22:22. So you understand what this Peter is doing here in Dante. Because Alighieri is part of the white Guelphs in the dispute between the white and black Guelphs, which sort of inherited this dispute about who should rule, right? This is during the time in which you have the papal states projecting power onto Florence. And Dante is opposed to papal authority. So again, this is kind of, if you will, a prototype of the Reformation, what's going on with Frederick and other rulers. Frederick's kind of like an early version of a Henry VIII, no offense to Anglicans, but he's opposing papal authority. He wants to set up his own thing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's sort of what's going on with Dante. He's not saying let's get rid of the Pope, but he wants to curb the political power of the popes. That's why a lot of these popes are going to find their way into the deepest, darkest caverns of hell. But he's also taking shots at political figures who would assume a sort of role that Peter had. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. We'll keep going. We're in the 14th into the 13th century. We'll take a step to talk about one of the first doctors of the church that I think we're hitting upon, which is the subtle doctor, the Venerable John Duns Scotus, a Franciscan. And this is one of the commentaries on the sentences. So about 1302, this is early 14th century we're talking, okay, as opposed to the end of the 14th century. Oh no, Dante's early 14th century as well. I'm getting my dates mixed up. Anyways, here, it's interesting, a few things I want to note. First, we have to be careful when we're reading medieval works that this is kind of coming up as an objection. So you have to understand that. He's referencing Isaiah chapter 22 and quotes this passage. The whole point of this is that the church doesn't have the keys. This is the objection, right? So the question is, who has the keys? And the obvious objection, if you're going to come up with one, is that Christ has the keys, not the church, right? And so it's quoting Revelation 3 and then saying this was predicted, right, in Isaiah chapter 22. And so the whole task of this commentary on the sentences in this particular question is to reconcile Revelation 3:7 with Matthew 16:19, and Isaiah 22:22 comes up consistently. And so the reconciliation is that indeed that these keys, the very same keys, were promised to Peter. Okay, and so we see here also that he makes reference to the church, to the house of God, which is the church, and that sort of parallels the house of David, right? So we have the keys to the house of God, is Scotus's reconciliation to this. So that's sort of what I wanted to comment here. There's not a lot more that I can say, except that that for him it is the same key, right? That's being used.
Yeah, I have nothing to say. Keep going.
Okay. Some of these might go faster than others, but here is, excuse my bad French, Pierre de Terentes, 13th century, the most famous doctor, became Blessed Pope Innocent V. Another commentary on the sentences, okay? So we're back into the 13th century. This is Dominican. Is this our first Dominican? So there we go.
Yeah, I think so far.
Okay, so we have Dominicans are on the board. And same question as Scotus from the sentences. Here, he's a bit more pithy, which I like, but for some reason, I don't know why, this looks like a typo. It says Isaiah 31, but it is clearly Dabo, Clavum, etc. And then it's talking about that this is Christ in the Passion, that's what the connection to the Isaiah 22. He's more explicit. He references Isaiah 22 here in the response. And what I want to say here is Isaiah's passage is fulfilled through Christ's passion. What Christ has opened, no one can shut. So what about Peter? Can't Peter shut? Like, what's going on there? Right? That's the objection. Right? Christ saying, I can shut it. And this might actually go to the verb. I remember you talk a bit about this, that what Peter looses and binds will have been done in heaven. So it's not that Peter's sort of operating it independently or even before God, but it's sort of, if we were to put it like from a metaphysical standpoint, that heaven has priority here. Am I misrepresenting what you're saying?
No. I mean, like, so yeah, in the Greek, it's whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. And so, like people like Charles Talbert and their commentaries on Matthew, they'll talk about how the traditional interpretation of this kind of weird, kind of tense construction, it's saying that what Peter binds on earth, it's not he binds and then heaven follows, it's he follows what heaven has declared.
Right. And I think you get a similar response here from Pope Innocent V. And that is, he even says here, right, that in this place it's it's the locking is universal, not particular, or the lock is universally held by Christ. So it's almost as if Christ turned a key that opened up heaven, and then the church operates that key on a more particular basis, if you will. Well, I guess I'm reading into it, but he's just saying it's not in the particular. And so my inference would be, so maybe Peter is sort of more on a case-by-case situation. But anyways, it is explicit here that Matthew 16, it is said that Peter, and in Peter, the other apostles have the keys. Okay, so that's how he's interpreting this contra one. So going back up to here, to this idea of Isaiah and Revelation. Okay. All right, we'll keep going. This is St. Thomas Aquinas. How do you say it? No, I'm mispronouncing all the other names, so I'm just. All right, so obviously this is the reference you had gathered, but I wanted to include it to be as complete as possible. Obviously a Dominican, 13th century, the angelic doctor, so another doctor of the church. And here we're drawing from his commentary on Matthew. I don't know if I can find a reference in the sentences. They're really hard to find. I've had a hard time finding it, but that might be, if someone's interested in exploring it, let me know if they find it. But here, the keys of Matthew remove the impediments of entering the kingdom of heaven. The keys are identified as the passion and blood of Christ, which again goes back to Jerome and St. Ambrose. And then the keys are the keys. Basically, he just explains it in terms of the ministerial keys that are given in Isaiah 22:22, and he quotes it explicitly there at the end. You can see Davos super upon the keys of David, right? And so he's talking about the very passage we're focused on.
And then he mentions, and then he mentions, Peter in the beginning. And so in the same passage where he's talking about Peter receiving the keys at the very end, he mentions Isaiah 22:22 to explain that idea. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that these are ministerial keys. So
Mm-hmm.
even though Eliakim's not mentioned by name, we understand he's a minister. So if you're trying to understand this in a non-typological way, I think that's stretched, because it's a ministerial key being given to a minister of an emperor, right? So, or a king. So, who are we talking about? We're talking about Eliakim.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Saint Bonaventure, the seraphic doctor. Now, I was trying to figure out, what does seraphic mean? It's of pertaining to the seraphim, but what does that make you? Like, because I looked up some definitions say, well, that makes you like nice and friendly, but I think of the seraphim as like frightening and mystical.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's some sort of that like sublime mystical doctor, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And he is kind of like, and how would you contrast Bonaventure to Aquinas? Because they're often compared, right? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
No, not really. No, I mean, maybe people have said that Bonaventure is a bit more mystical, right? And kind of, whereas Aquinas is kind of characterized as very kind of logical and heady, although I don't know if that's a fair characterization, but, yeah.
He had his mystical moments too, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here again, commentary on the sentences. I had a hard time capturing everything I want to, but you can see he references again.
Mm-hmm.
This is explicitly from Isaiah 22:22. We know, because he's talking about being put on the shoulder,
Mm-hmm.
the keys being put on the given and put on the shoulder, right? And so again, this is this issue of how do we reconcile Isaiah 20:22 to Matthew 16:19, really through Revelation 3:7, because the idea is, well, Christ has the key that Eliakim had. But again, the answer is the same, right? Again, he talks about the various obstacles that the keys overcome, which give you a sense of the various powers. And what he says, this a threefold key: the first, that of the authority, which is his, Christ; the second is of the excellence, which this is in Christ alone; and the third is the key of the ministry, which descends from the key of authority through the key of excellence. Okay, so again, it's not the same key, but they're almost causally linked, is the way I like to think of it. And so again, going back to this idea of Christ having the keys versus giving the keys, and then tying it back to Isaiah 22:22. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so I don't know if it's in the picture that you have there, but you're saying that Bonaventure then quotes Matthew 16:19. So
yes,
Matthew 16:19 is in the proximity of
yeah.
the mentioning of Isaiah 22. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant when I said I didn't capture all of this. It was just kind of all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I could bring it up, but he's definitely, again, the whole issue behind this commentary, which goes back to Peter Lombard, is who has the keys.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's this conflict between Christ having it and Peter having it, which kind of, even today in your discussions with Dr. Ortlund, right, he wants to say, well, look at Revelation 3:7. It's Christ who has that key.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really this commentary issue. And the doctors of the church are consistent in saying, well, at least an aspect of that key was given to Peter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I have an article in Catholic Answers responding to that Revelation 3:7 objection. So I'll just put a plug in for myself. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. All right. So Hugh of Saint Cher, another Dominican, 13th century, and he wrote on the various senses of Scripture, including the literal, allegorical, anagogical, and moral sense. So this is very much an exegetical work, or work on how to read Scripture. And here he's commenting on the meaning of the keys in Revelation 3:7. And he's very explicit that the Jews discussed this key in Isaiah 22, right? So he's connecting the two passages.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says here, you can see Matthew 16 is mentioned up here. You see Isaiah 22,
Yeah.
right? So definitely talking about it. And he says that it's given in a singular way to Peter, right? And he says that through what Christ said, right? And there it's passed. The passage is quoted in Latin there. And then he goes on to talk about some of the powers that this key has. A lot of them, we'll tie it back to that Luke. Does he talk about Luke here? Others do. But the idea of binding, loosing, understanding scripture, all right, and power over death and those sorts of things. So all those various aspects of the keys are mentioned there. Okay. Stop me if you want to focus on anything. I know some of these are a little repetitive, but we're really just trying to build a case that this is like a consistent message, especially from this period. The 13th century is just loaded with all of the greats. You know, here's the passage that I sent you a couple of weeks ago from the universal doctor, the mentor of Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great. Okay, and this is from a commentary on Matthew. And you see he's directly referencing the passage, Matthew 16:19 up here, and he talks about it, the binding and loosing. And then he gets into a discussion of its significance in light of Isaiah 22:22. He quotes it there. And he says that Peter and his successors received the keys in a singular way in the fullness of power. And that, when he means the successors of Peter, he means the bishops in line of Peter, the popes, right? And so this is something that he's very explicit about. Okay? Keep going. Still in the 13th century, a lot from there. This is Franciscan, the irrefutable doctor. Man, if you ever become a doctor of the church, Swan, what's going to be your title?
I'll let the church decide that one.
I'll say the joyous doctor, but
the joyous doctor.
But you got to get the Dominicans to be convinced to let you get your PhD or something. I don't know. All right. Anyways, sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you.
No, that's fine. Don't worry.
But I love that, the irrefutable doctor. Some of these titles are so fun. All right, so here is a commentary on Revelation, on the Apocalypse of John. He talks about the universal power and governance of the Davidic keys that Christ has, which I'm trying to understand this virtualis reparationis, which I understand is sort of like virtually reconstructs Isaiah, and then Isaiah 22. I think that's what the idea that it's basically saying that it is a reconstruction of that very passage,
because it's not a verbatim
right
quotation,
which he connects to spiritual administration, spiritual ministry, and then connects it to, and this is another weird typo, Matthew, is that 17? I don't know why. I don't know, some of these typos, or maybe is it Matthew 7? I don't know why. Yeah, Septima.
Well, sometimes, they do have these typos, and it's known, for instance, among Aquinas scholars, and it's usually because these men had memorized scripture.
Yeah.
And so they didn't always have the text right in front of them. They would just cite scripture from their own memory. And sometimes they would get the number wrong.
So, that's something that, we as Catholics, we should take pride in, because, our Protestant brothers and sisters can quote chapter and verse, but even the irrefutable can't. So that's more Catholic, right? We're like, well, I saw it on a stained glass window once, and I don't know where it's in the Bible, but anyways. But here again, tibi dabo clavis regni calorum. So that's a quote directly from Matthew 16:19.
Yeah, I'm just looking at what you have here, and they're in such close proximity to each other, right? Like he just mentions Isaiah 22:22, and then he goes down then to Matthew's gospel and talks about the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and so they're put right in proximity of each other.
Through this idea of spiritual ministry or administration, right? Yeah. Okay. Now we've got to get a little musical. I promised you I'd sing this, but I really didn't practice well enough to do it. But I wanted to talk about O Clavis David, which is one of the O antiphons, which are messianic titles that are drawn from Isaiah, right? Particularly in O Clavis David, Isaiah 22:22, right? So we know this probably best through everyone's favorite Advent hymn, O Come, Emmanuel, right? So one of the verses, they basically go through the O antiphons in that song. And it's such a beautiful Advent hymn. I play it year round, but the text for the O antiphons probably date from around the time of Pope Gregory. In fact, I found a reference that Pope Gregory might have actually it's being attributed to him, or at least it's the same time. So we're back to like the 6th and 7th century, but that doesn't necessarily tie it to Matthew 16:19. But we do get that through some Cistercian and Benedictine monks, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Thomas Cistercian, and Thomas Hilgernus. So again, I'm sorry if I stumble over things. And these are commentaries on the Song of Songs. So another, the mellifluous doctor is Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. So here you can find a reference to the O antiphon title, O Clavis David, which is a title for Christ that goes back to Isaiah 22:22. And then it goes on to talk about what? That this key has been given to Peter, right?
Yeah, I see right there.
Yeah. And then over here, same idea, right? So here we're talking about O Clavis David, right? Opening and shutting. And then it goes on to say, and about this keys, right? Who has them and where are they, right? It talks in terms of Peter, right? Has the keys, was given the keys, accepted the keys, right? So again, Christ is the key. Christ is the key of David. Peter accepted him through his declaration that was revealed to him by the Father, that he is the Son of the living God, right? And that key, notice I will give you the keys, right? And people say, well, when's he going to get it? Well, Christ has to die and suffer first, right? So suffer and die first, and then the keys are given, right? And you see again, the references are clear. Matthew 16:19 is right there. Okay. The Venerable Hervéus of Bordeaux, Benedictine, commentary on Isaiah. Now we're in the 12th century, getting back in time now. Here, and again, this is a Ming compilation that I found, the Patrologica Latinae 181. So if you want to check it out, here, Venerable Hervéus connects Isaiah 22:22, Revelation 3:7, Matthew 16:19. And you can see that all here, right? The key of the house of David is it's connected to the church, right? Upon the shoulder. So this is explicitly not just Revelation. This makes it Isaiah, right? Then we get this idea of opening and shutting, binding and loosing as well, right? So it's clearly the two are in mind. Open, shut, right? And then connected directly to Matthew 16:19 as well, right? And he gave the keys first to the first pastor, right? That's kind of an interesting way of put it, who represents the rest.
Where's that stated?
Let me see if I can find it. He talks about Shebna and Eliakim there. pretty
Mhm.
explicitly. Sorry, let me see. Let me take my time.
Mhm. Because is the word pastor used there, or is it
Yeah, so you just took a little pause there, but yeah, I found it. It's right here. Uh,
Mhm.
right, the first pastor, right? And then he quotes explicitly, who's the first pastor? Well, Peter.
Mhm.
Okay, so we got pretty clear reference here, even explicitly talking about Eliakim and Peter, the same keys,
Mhm.
right? And this is 12th century. So this is well before any Reformation apologetic going on. We're way back in time now, but maybe not satisfying the patristic requirement for
Sure.
typology.
Mhm.
So we're going to have to keep going.
But it seems like, a lot of the quotations that you have so far, they're kind of concentrated, right, to at least post schism. Um, but that's just a kind of comment or thing that I noticed.
That's right.
But I don't think that detracts from its validity if it is in the text itself. But it's just interesting to note that, I don't know, at least we don't know what the trend is originally, but we see a spike, right, in these types of connections being made post schism.
That's right. Yeah, and honestly, I haven't searched for how Orthodox post schism are treating this passage.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I think it would be difficult to really find a strong case for typology there, from a merely rhetorical standpoint. But I just don't know. And maybe that's something Ubi Petrus can fill us in on it, or somebody else who's got the time to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Saint Rabanus Maurus. Yeah, sorry, I'm so bad with names, but so 9th century. A lot of these people, part of what I really appreciated in working on this project was just learning some of the people I just didn't know in church history, because I'm not a church historian. I'm sure people were like, "Oh, Saint Rabanus, I'm glad he came up with my favorite saint," and that was my confirmation name. I didn't know about Rabanus really, but there he is teaching over here, and Benedictine. So we're in the 9th century, and here, this is an encyclopedia work. Again, similar if we went back to the 14th century with, what was it? Um, Ranulf or something like that. Another sort of way in which people would look at this work to get an idea of scriptural connections and intertextual connections, things like that. And here he has a passage on keys, right? So he talks about clavis est Christus, right? The key is Christ, right? Connecting to the key of understanding, or the key of knowledge of Christ, right? So then talks about opening sacred scripture. And in the prophet, this is Isaiah, as in the prophet, right? Isaiah. So that's how he's understanding what this key does. It opens up scripture, and then he quotes Isaiah, and also quotes the Apocalypse. This is from chapter 20, the key of the abyss. And then he starts to talk about that the keys were the power to teach, potestates doctorum, power to teach, as in the evangelist Matthew, right? And then he
Mm-hmm.
quotes Matthew 16:19.
Yep. Beautiful, straightforward. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is first millennium now,
Mm-hmm.
and pretty explicit connections here of the same, of this key. It's not different keys really. It's this key. It's the key of the house of David, is unlocking scripture as foretold by the prophet and the evangelist. Okay. So I'm saying okay a lot, just like I don't want to move on too quickly, but
Yeah, no worries. Just keep going.
and Saint Andreas of Caesarea. Now we're in the 7th century. He wrote apparently the oldest patristic commentary on Revelation, which is kind of cool. And you can look at it in Greek and Latin. Migne, this is the Greek editions, this volume 106. Cappadocian patristic witness. So now we're in the patristic period. So this could be considered, again, evidence that this typology goes all the way back. And what I found was a passage here. You can see Matthew 16:19. These footnotes are obviously put in by the editor, but you can see who has the keys of David. So this is obviously a reference to, if it's commentary on Revelation, it's 3:7, right? He's talking about that passage and the powers of it, right? The power to close and open domum. And this I thought was significant, because if you go to Revelation 3:7, he's not talking about a house, but who is? Who talks about a house? Isaiah, right? And so it's this power to open and shut the house. And then he connects it directly to Peter, right? And this is made manifest that who has the keys is Christ, because he gives it to Peter. And then he quotes Matthew 16:19. So the editor didn't expressly cite Isaiah 22:22, but Andreas of Caesarea probably had Isaiah 22:22 in mind if he's talking about the key of David and a house, right? Because I think it would be known that Revelation 3:7 has a typological connection, or I shouldn't say type, an intertextual connection back to Isaiah 22:22. Okay, so again, not explicit. So you could ramp up your skepticism if you like and say, oh, this is too tenuous, but I still think there's a strong case to be made here.
Yeah, I don't think it's tenuous at all. Yeah, I mean, and as you said before, and this is actually an excellent point that I never realized, but in Revelation 3:7, it's, even though it portrays itself as verbatim quoting Isaiah 22:22, it actually does some variation to show that Jesus has the key, but it's not, it doesn't say house of David, it just says of David, right? The key is of the house of is of David. And so the fact that this writer here includes house shows that he is either assuming that Revelation 3:7 includes house, or he has in mind the allusion back to Isaiah 22. And then regardless, he makes the connection then to Matthew 16:19 with Peter receiving the key of the kingdom of heaven, or the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think this is a pretty powerful witness.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this alone, I think you can't really say there's patristic silence at this point. And you can see we still have a little ways to go.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Little ways. So those who are still watching this, I appreciate it. Let's keep going. Back in the DeLorean. Saint Theodore of Cyrus, 5th century. This guy, the saint, I shouldn't say guy, right? That was that irreverent. Right at the center of the Theotokos controversy. So I have a heart for that. You know, I had that discussion on your channel with Jerry Walls. Looking forward, by the way, to the discussion you're going to host with Christopher Tomaszewski and I'm sorry, I don't recall.
Yeah, his name is Israel, and then I don't want to pronounce his last name until I have him on the show, so he can correct me. But I think it's like Trulio or something like that, or Trujillo. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, if you need someone to mispronounce the name, I'm always there for you. It's Thomas Aquinas, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. So he's at the center of the Theotokos controversy, writing against Nestorius. And he's a Greek patristic witness here. And I think this is a really cool reference that I found. He's writing a commentary on Isaiah. You can see this in the PG 81, page 355, verse 22 of Isaiah. I cut it off just so I could fit it all here, and it's got the Greek next to it, so we can look at the Greek a little bit. But here he says, he quotes the verse, and I will give the keys of the house of David. And then he says, this place we are prefigured. And then he quotes Matthew, saying that we have that what will be bound on earth and in heaven. And this is a quote from Matthew 18:18. We know it's not Matthew 16. I said Matthew 18:19, thereabouts, right? So that's a typo. That should say 19. But we know that this is a quote from Matthew 18:18, which maybe if you're in the Orthodox camp, you're saying, see, the keys are given to all the apostles, and he's connecting the keys to that. And the answer to that is yes, exactly. The Catholic Church, as Michael Lofton has often explained, all the bishops carry the keys. That's explicit Catholic teaching. But why bring up keys of the house of David and then talk about binding and loosing in heaven and earth, right? So the answer is he's obviously got Matthew 16:19 in mind as well. And we can even see that Ming footnotes Matthew 16:19, not Matthew 18:18 there, but that might be a typo on his part or whatever source he's drawing on. The other thing that I kind of wanted to highlight about this passage, it's hard to see in the Greek there, it says protypontai, with type, the word prefigure, type. He's saying the church is typologically prefigured by this passage in Isaiah 22:22, in the keys of the house of David, which are being given to the church. Obviously, when did that happen? That happened in Matthew 16:19. So
yeah, and really quick, Matt, remind me again, how did you deduce that it was Matthew 18:18 and not 16:19?
Oh yeah, so if you look at the Greek, and probably the Latin too, but I just don't. I'm more of the Greek. You can look at the verbs here. Where is it? It's hard to read, but yeah, you look at the verbs and it's that it shows the plural
for whatever you, right? You plural.
Yeah.
So him, us.
David, yeah. For yeah, I think it's right there. You can sort of see, and then yeah, I had to go back to look at what Matthew 18:18 is. I compared it, and it was pretty clear. Desete is the plural.
Okay.
Desete.
So then then what you were arguing is that like the implied bridge between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 18:18, because this commentator, Saint Theodoret, mentions keys, but then he launches into binding and loosing, the implied bridge verse is Matthew 16:19. Although because he's applying it to the church as this corporate phenomenon of persons, right? He was going to use the plural persons that are in Matthew 18:18 rather than the singular person Peter in Matthew 16:19.
Right. It's a very economic way of trying to say, trying to include the whole church as being prefigured by what's going on in Isaiah 22:22 with Eliakim, right? And the obvious idea that what's explicit here that I think is significant is that he's saying it's typological. The connection between the two is not just intertextual here. It's explicitly. And maybe you say, well, he doesn't have an academic notion of typology. That's something I did want to ask you, because you've studied it a little bit more. But I hear a lot of people say things like valid typology versus
Mhm.
invalid typology. I'm a logician, so I don't like the use of the word valid outside of the context of deduction.
Yeah. Mhm.
Uh, and so outside of that context, I like to talk in terms of weak versus strong connections, which is more of the language of induction. So what's going on there? What exactly, how do we determine what a valid typology is? Isn't it really what we're trying to do is trying to understand authorial intent
Right.
to a degree?
So, yeah, I mean, so, and this is part of my ongoing research right now, and so I don't want to go too deep into it just now, right? But
Right.
typology is this idea, and I mentioned this on Dustin Quick's podcast, Holy Smokes. But I mean, the idea is that you have a historical correspondence between an earlier anti type and later anti-type, right? And it's a fulfilling kind of correspondence within some type of divinely intended promise. Um, and so I think that there are other things too that it reveals, like the character of God, his consistency with his dealings in humans, and so on and so forth. But when the use of prefigure, or was it prototypos, or as
Prototypon type. Yeah. So I
yeah,
use prototype because it's the closest English word for
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean,
It's a
like,
prototype. It's a, yeah.
like, what was it? A lot of the research that's been done academically into typology, it's also been done in Greek text and literature as well. And the Greek is typos, right? To
Yeah.
like in Philo of Alexandria and others. And so, I mean, the word that he's using would pass the academic standard of like, oh, okay, he's claiming a typological connection here. Now, the extent to which it is strong or not, it's going to depend on other arguments. But I mean, he's using the language of typology, and this is,
Yeah.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you can make this connection unless you go through Matthew 16:19. I don't, if I were reading that, I and say I got to keep 16:19 out of this, it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, and like even you mentioned, so I'm looking at the Facebook post where I mentioned this quotation, and you commented on why it's 1818. You mentioned that a certain, I think it's a verb, or excuse me, something like that, is in second person plural. Does
Yeah,
that ring a
second person
bell?
plural. Yeah, the discite is
Mm-hmm.
right there. It's hyphenated, so it took me a second to spot, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's second plural,
Mm-hmm.
which mean it's being applied to multiple people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all the apostles.
All right, let's
All
go for
right.
number one.
Yeah, so this one, 306 to 373, patron of the Syriac people and the Syriac father. And this comes from Homily on Our Lord. And there he is smiling at us, right? St. Ephrem the Syrian, 4th century. This, I got to give a shout out to Kevin Rice, our friend online, who in a post that was sort of raising the question about, is there any connection here between the two passages? He cited this, and it's a very interesting passage. I'm not sure of the theology behind some of what St. Ephrem's saying, because he talks about Christ sometimes as a steward and as a treasurer, from what I understand, which is kind of weird. But let's just read the passage and maybe we'll comment on it. That it says, "Then Mary received her firstborn and went forth. He was outwardly wrapped in swaddling clothes, but secretly he was clothed with prophecy and priesthood," right? Uh, Whatsoever then was handed down from Moses was received from Simeon, but continued and was possessed by the Lord of both. So then the steward first and the treasurer lastly handed over the keys of priesthood and prophecy to him who has authority over the treasury of them both. So I'm not sure who these are referencing.
Mm-hmm. This is just
But
my guess, right? But so Shebna was originally the steward over the house of Hezekiah, and then he gets demoted into something like a secretary. But he was also responsible for
treasurer,
collecting
right?
the yeah,
Yeah.
being a treasurer. And
Yeah.
so maybe there's this idea of like Shebna and Eliakim being alluded to here. I'm not sure, but let's just keep going. Mhm.
Therefore, his father gave him the Spirit, not by measure, John 3:34, because all measures of the Spirit are under his hand, and that our Lord might show that he received the keys from the former stewards. He said to Simeon, to you I will give the keys of the doors. Matthew 16:19, which is kind of that's put in there by whatever reference I got this from, New Advent.
Yeah.
But how should he have given them to another and he not received them from another? So then the keys which he had received from Simeon the priest, them he gave to another Simeon the apostle, that even though the people had not hearkened to the former Simeon, the Gentiles might hearken to the latter Simeon. So there's a lot going on there, and I have to say I'm a little bit perplexed at times by this, but there's some significance here, right? We're definitely getting the connection between keys and stewards, right? And so it's not an explicit reference to Isaiah 22:22, but where in the Bible do we talk about keys and stewards, right? It has that as a proximity. Like I think some people talk about echoes, and I would say that this clearly shows that there's a sense in which there's a passing along of the same key from obviously pre-Christ, right, Old Testament, through Christ to Peter. My guess is we're talking about the very same key, right, the key of the house of David. Mm-hmm. So that gets you to the 4th century, another patristic witness.
Yeah, I mean, what I want to say here too is that as time passed, especially in the Targums and the Aramaic translations of the Old Testament, eventually the key of Eliakim was turned into the key of the high priest. And then so, right here we have Simeon the priest. And so I'm wondering if he's referencing, the prophet Simeon at the temple in Luke's gospel. And if that's the case, then although Isaiah 22:22 is not explicitly mentioned here, it's implied that the keys of the steward are really like kind of priestly keys, right? And so Eliakim is wrapped within that lineage, right? But then that priestly key lineage, right, is finally handed on to Peter. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I just, like I said, there's a lot going on in the passage, and I couldn't find too many commentaries explaining what St. Ephrem's about here. So, yeah. So that was our last passage. There are a couple of other things that, we're in bonus round now, I suppose. These are things when I initially researched it, when I first heard your argument and then heard people for tradition. St. John Cassian came up in one group chat, and it's an interesting passage from On the Incarnation 3:12, if you want to check it out. It does discuss the key in singular instead of the keys, and that people are saying that seems to tie with Isaiah 22:22 because it's a key. And he talks about opening and shutting, and I think there might be a reference to a house. I can't recall now, but this comes up in the debate between James White and Mark Bonacore, which you can see online. I think they have an email exchange about it. And so that was the source he went to when challenged by White as to whether there was any tradition. And that's the only source he really slam dunk gives. I kind of left it out of the main discussion just because I thought it was a little bit too weak, but sometimes I think it's a good reference. I just want to see more scholarship around it. The other quote is from Aphrahad the Persian, St. Aphrahad the Persian, the 4th century, references David handing over the kingdom to Solomon and then Christ handing keys to Peter. It's a bit tenuous because David to Solomon is king to king, and there's no real reference there to keys being transferred. So I don't know if this really has much to do with Isaiah 22:22. I don't know if you disagree with that, but still
Well, yeah.
a point of interest, you
Yeah, I
know?
mean, but given the Davidic background and then Christ handing the keys to Simon Peter, it's obviously, I guess, the implications that it's the key of the house of David, right?
Yeah,
And so, in a very remote way, Isaiah 22 might be invoked, but in a very
right.
remote way.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's sort of what's going on here. These two passages of St. John Cassian and St. Aphrahat they're more remote, I think, but they're not to be dismissed if you're taking kind of this Bayesian approach where we really want to take all the evidence in and really consider it. So what fits with which hypothesis? What do we expect, right? And I think they still are data points to worth considering. And then the last thing I sort of want to explicitly mention is St. Melito's Sardis, 2nd century. Now, this one I found and I sent to you, and I was super excited, and I think I made you really excited. He wrote a book entitled On the Keys, which is referenced by St. Eusebius and St. Jerome. And so then I find in Ming's Patrologia Graeca, Volume 5, I find excerpts from it, from this On the Keys, which explicitly references and connects Isaiah 22:22 to Matthew 16:19, talking about binding and loosing, and then talking about it being going back to Isaiah. So I was like, well, this is a slam dunk reference. I really want to include it. But then, I wanted to look more about where this fragment comes from. And it really, what happened was they discovered a book in the 17th century or 16th century, I think, which was called On the Keys. And they just attribute it to St. Melito because they knew from Jerome and Eusebius that he wrote a book with that title. But today, most people say it's not a spurious work in the sense that it was like purposely written with St. Melito attached to it. It was just misattributed to him. So we could call this like a pseudo-Melito or Melito, pseudo-Melito, which but we really can't really date it, and certainly not to the 2nd century. So it's not of no value. It's likely a medieval source. We just don't know when, but it does make an explicit reference there.
But another thing worth mentioning then is, as you put, that On the Keys, written in the 2nd century, was likely lost, right? And so, I mean, what a treasure it would be if we could have, that book, because if it's on the keys, then who knows, maybe there could have been an allusion in there or something was done. But because we don't have the text now, we can't pretend as if, oh yeah, we exhaustively have all what the church fathers said. And so, even if the evidence is lacking, it's like, well, is it lacking because there's no allusion, or is it lacking because there's something in the sources missing, or we just have fragments or things like that? I mean, this is the same kind of logic behind, for instance, how we believe that there was an Exodus, even though the evidence in the Sinai desert is very fragmentary.
Right. Right. And again, it goes back to that earlier slide where I was talking about the argument from silence being weak. We know we have things that might have, I mean, I can't bet on it, but I mean, if we ever did find it, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a reference in there, if it's a whole book on scripture and keys. So then you say, well, the patristic sources were completely silent. I think we put that one to bed, right? And then Melito's Sardis, who knows? Maybe you and I will put on our Indiana Jones gear and go into Syria for it.
Oh, I want to find that book now so bad. But let me just say this, and then I want to hear your concluding thoughts. But it seems like if we were like drawing a graph of like allusions between Isaiah and Matthew, we'd have a little bit like in the 4th century, right? And then we have like a few, and I think you mentioned a source from the 700s and the 900s, right? And so like it'll pick up a little bit again, and then when we get after the schism and closer to the Reformation, just shoots up. So I mean, what this suggests to me is that, I mean, the fact that we do have patristic allusions that are very clearly made, like Theodoret, right? It shows that the allusion was kind of loosely in circulation, but it wasn't, maybe super widespread in the Christian church.
Yeah, what's pressing right now, at the time? That's what they're talking about. They're not,
Right.
I just don't think your universal jurisdiction of the Roman pontiff was like the most pressing issue when you've got Arians and you've got Nestorians and you've got questions about it's like the Eucharist. Why isn't that brought up more? It's frustrating when you're talking to people about the real presence and you have to, okay, well, it's kind of here, it's kind of there. And, it's not where I want it. I want this person to say explicitly these words. And you can get really frustrated when you're talking to skeptics and non-Catholics. Like, why don't you see the evidence I'm giving you? And it's like, well, they didn't say it this way.
Yeah.
And this church father didn't say it that way. And it's like, well, this is the evidence we have. And the fact is, a lot of it's lost and a lot of it is passed over. The issue is passed over because it wasn't the pressing issue of their day.
And I'll say just maybe two last things, and then, we can, you can say what you want to say. But sure. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I'm worried about, though, is that now people are going to start changing the goalpost now that we have like these quotes, because what they're going to say is now, oh, there might be an illusion, right? But where's the full typology between Eliakim and Peter? And it's like, no, hold on. You said there wasn't an illusion. We just refuted that, right? And now it's the job of us as, theologians and biblical theologians to try and show why the illusion is there and draw out the theology behind the scriptures, right?
Right.
The other thing that I want to say too is that, when I think about maybe another image to use rather than a graph is, when we look at the contemporary consensus on the illusion, scholars, there's a widespread consensus, right? That there is an illusion between Isaiah and Matthew in Matthew 16:19. And then you see this vast ocean, even this vast ocean being present in, during the time of the Reformation and post-schism. And then when you keep on following it, you realize it comes from a gentle stream, And so I think what happened is that this illusion was carried very softly through at least the first millennium. And then once it was discovered again, or, somebody had found it and circulated it, and then they saw it was useful to defend the papacy, it exploded again.
Right. And this is, I'm no Newman scholar either, but this is kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about authentic development, right? That there's something in seed form that blossoms. And so I think what we're seeing is that the church, what I would say is, well, this is a consistent message throughout 2 millennia, that this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about different kinds of keys. We're really talking about the same keychain. We're talking about the same authority. That it's Christ's authority. It's the authority that Christ had when standing up against the Sanhedrin, when standing up against the Pharisees. That authority that we see in Acts 4 when Peter and John go to face down Caiaphas and Ananias, right? That authority to speak from God, which was so remarkable about Christ. You read the Gospels today. I think my former professor Peter Craig talks about when he encountered Christ in the Gospels, you see this authority in him that is just so compelling. And it's the authority that shocked a nation, right? That he was not citing this rabbi before him or that. He said, I say, and he gives that authority to his apostles that he sends forth. This authority to speak, not their own authority. He doesn't say, okay, now everyone's their own authority, right? It's, I'm giving you me because it's my blood. That's what I thought was, in going through all this, right? To get back to Christ, which is the center of all of this, right? That what Christ gives Peter is Christ, right? So here's the last slide. So I wanted to feature this image, which you promised me you'd get a tattoo on your back of this image, right? So
Wait, do you say
You
I
got to clear
promise or
that.
I
You got to
promise
clear
not
that with
to?
you got to clear that with the
Mhm.
Dominicans first. But I want it full back, right?
Yeah.
This is not an early source, the 19th century. So this is, around the time of the First Vatican Council, right? And we have the keys being passed from Christ to Peter, and then we have all of these. I don't know if you can see. It's kind of hard. It's a little blurry, but these are passages you've cited
Mhm.
and others cite that support the various roles of the Pope, right? So pontifex, it looks like Leviticus 21, pastor, right? My pastor, Isaiah is at 44, right? I can't even read this one. Priest, right? First Kings 2. And then it says at top, et dapo clabum domus David super, and then umeros, right?
Mhm.
Upon the shoulder, Isaiah 22:22. And there, bottom, right? This is the passage from Ezekiel about giving us a pastor for us, right? Which is in one way, who's the good shepherd? It's him. Not leaving his flock on earth abandoned, right? I remember Gavin Ortland talks about, we can't be cherry picking about what this analogy, this typology gives and what it doesn't give. And like, Eliakim would have had, military power, but Christ doesn't give Peter military power. Well, historically, of course, some popes assumed military power, but I loved your response to that, which I just want to highlight that we are at war. We're the church militant. We need a general on earth. We are in a very big war right now, and if we are without a commander on earth, we are in trouble,
Mhm.
right? But I think we have a general on earth, so all is not lost. Anyways, so my conclusion: first of all, Christ is the key. He has the key. He's not given the keys, I think, in the sense that he is the fulfillment of the Davidic king. We can see that. So if we see this typological connection with Eliakim, is Eliakim the first among equals? No. There aren't equals to him. He is the steward. He is like Joseph in Egypt, right? He is basically next to Pharaoh and equal in power. If you go back to Genesis, I think that really gives you an idea of what the Jews, how they understood stewardship when they were setting up their own kingdom. They were looking back to Joseph. Is Peter merely first in time? Well, he was, in a sense, first in time, although he isn't the very first who says Jesus is the Messiah. He is the first apostle to say this, right? But Eliakim's not the first of anything. He's just one in a line, right? So I don't think you get those counter explanations that I've heard some give if we really want to make that connection. Are we all Eliakim? Who has the keys? And what you're seeing is Christ has the keys first and foremost. But so does Peter in a special way, in a singular way, as we saw with some of the doctors of the church. And then through him, the apostles. And in a certain sense, all Christians who minister are operating those keys, every priest, and even all the laity who are baptized into being prophet, priest, and king, right? We're not in the same way. And I even suggested the anonymous Christian, right, could be operating those keys, which is so beautiful that the Christ is giving himself even to people who aren't even aware necessarily. So what do we have? It's sort of in sum. We have church councils defining papal infallibility, talking about this. We have Counter-Reformation apologetics. We have, by my count, 7 doctors of the church, including some of the most influential theological heavyweights of the medieval era. We have secular political allusions in poetry. We have exegetical glossaries and commentaries. And we have 4 solid sources in the first millennium, going back to the 5th century and even the 4th century. I could include Ephraim the Syrian, and 3 patristic sources that I've included. And that's that.
All right. Well, Daniel, I'm excited to see how people interact with the work that you've done, and really appreciate all that all that you've done to assemble, these quotations. And if I recall properly, you just went on Google Books, right? And you tried to like type in the Latin, and so that's like the main
part of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Part of it was a lot of late night just searching different combinations of words to see what I could pull up. And yeah, many times Google asked me if I was a robot.
Oh, that's funny, Daniel. Well, well, I want to thank everybody for watching this episode today. And I hope that, if there's anybody else out there who has access or knows different languages, please come and, help out in finding maybe more of these connections that have not been translated into English. And it would really help, me, Daniel, and the entire church to see the beauty of this connection. And Daniel, thank you so much for really setting the trail on fire here, and really getting the mission going to go even further back than just Aquinas. You've done more than I can do in this area.
Well, thank you. And as you become brother, Suan, pray for me and pray for us. I'll be selfish. Pray for me, pray for my family. All right. I believe the prayers of holy people are very powerful, and I really truly believe you're going to go far, and I have every confidence in you. So
That's very sweet, Daniel. Thank you.